When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Before we begin this episode, I wanted to take a moment to address language. I don't think I'm saying anything that students of American history don't already know, in that primary sources sometimes contain words, thoughts, and sentiments that are problematic at best, and sometimes just downright deplorable. While I don't want to whitewash history and ignore these problematic points of history, as I think that exacerbates problems that we're still dealing with in terms of that legacy and/or creates a whole new set of problems. Likewise, I want to be mindful of you, dear listeners, as well as my partners in this work, in addition to my own sense of ethics. One of the opening quotes for this episode contained a 5-letter word that starts with an N and ends with an O that refers to Black people. That term is a complicated one, as though it was at times used derisively against Black people. In the course of the history of civil rights in America, it was sometimes used by members of the Black community to describe themselves. Indeed, Black leaders founded organizations and institutions with that word in the title for the advancement of the cause of civil rights, and the word can be found in speeches and works by Black individuals. Even the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used the word in reference to the Black community in speeches he delivered in the 1950s and 1960s. Since completely censoring the word would mean not using it in that context either, I did not want to do that. However, in appreciation of its potential negative connotations and recognizing that I'm a white man who strives to be an ally to the Black community and to the cause of equity, I will not use that word outside of the context of a quote from a primary source. And as with this quote, my opening quotes that I feel add to our understanding of the time that contain that word, I will read myself. I will not ask anyone else to say that word out of respect for them. In that vein, though the fort that was addressed in the quote from Jackson and is talked about in this episode is typically referred to as the N-word fort in historical accounts of it, I refer to it in this episode as Prospect Bluff, which, from my research, seems to be how the British who constructed it and the fort's inhabitants referred to it. While considering how to approach this word, naturally, it brought to mind the other N-word. That one I will not read out even in the case of it being in a primary source, as that terminology is based completely in derision and hatred. If I use a quote with that word in it, I will just insert a censor sound as a placeholder, and likewise, I will not ask anyone else to read those quotes either. I will also go ahead and tell you, dear listener, that we're going to have other problematic terminology ahead of us on this journey. I will continue to do my due diligence in considering how to approach the situation to provide information and insight on the past, while at the same time showing due respect to those who this language was used against, both in the past and at times in the present. With that said, thank you so much, and let's get to the episode. The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
There is no comparison between the two men. Madison is quick, temperate, and clear. Monroe, slow, passionate, and dull. Madison's word may always be relied on. I have known him from a boy. I am sorry to say I cannot bear the same testimony to Monroe. Former New York Governor Morgan Lewis to Representative John W. Taylor of New York, 22nd of December, 1815.
I am charged by my government to make known to you that a Negro fort erected during our late war with Britain has been strengthened since that period and is now occupied by upwards of 250 Negroes, many of whom have been enticed away from the service of their masters, citizens of the United States. Andrew Jackson to Mauricio de Zuniga, 23rd April, 1816.
We have had the most extraordinary year of drought and cold ever known in the history of America. In June, instead of 3 3/4 inches, our average for rain that month, we had only 1/3 of an inch. In August, instead of 9 1/6 inches, our average, we had only 8/10 of an inch. And still it continues. The summer, too, has been as cold as a moderate winter. In every state north of this, there has been frost in every month of the year. Every species of bread grain, taken together, will not be sufficient for the subsistence of the inhabitants. And the exportation of flour, already begun by the indebted and improvident to whatsoever degree it may be carried, will be exactly so much taken from the mouths of our own citizens. My anxieties on this subject are the greater because I remember the deaths which the drought of 1755 in Virginia produced from the want of food. Thomas Jefferson to Albert Gallatin, the 8th of September, 1816.
As the presidential election was in the works, 1816 was always going to be an interesting year. A successor to James Madison had to be settled upon, and there were some ambitious people who had their eye on the office of chief executive. However, it would quickly become apparent that Madison's last year in office was not going to be a quiet one, and indeed, nature itself would conspire to make it a year that few would forget. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Cassie from the Autocrat podcast and Meredith from the Alexander Standard podcast for providing these quotes. On the Alexander Standard, Meredith and her co-host Dustin are reviewing, rating, and ranking all of the successors of Alexander the Great from Perdiccas to Cleopatra VII. Personally, I have greatly enjoyed learning more about how all of these figures and the successor kingdoms of Alexander's massive empire interacted and reshaped the history of Africa, Europe, and Asia. If you haven't listened to it already, I hope you'll check out the 2-part episode on Ptolemy Kronos for both an amazing narrative story and, as you might hear, a familiar voice. Shifting our gaze geographically to the west, on Autocrat, Cassie and her co-host Vince explore Roman history starting at the very beginning of what the Romans would have considered history, the creation of the gods, and how the Trojan War would lead to the founding of Rome, and on through its 1,000-year history until the fall of the Eastern Empire. I recently joined them for a special episode on the influence of Rome on the early American Republic. It was a great discussion, and if it's not out by the time this episode launches, it should be out before too long, and you can listen to all their other great episodes to date while you're waiting. Autocrat is available wherever you get your podcast. I'll have links to both Autocrat and the Alexander Standard on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and we'll be sharing information about both on my social media around the release of this episode.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
In January 1816, James Madison entered the last full year of his presidency. Now, I haven't been able to find a specific date or letter where Madison said that he wasn't running for re-election, but it seems to have been understood by everyone that he would not seek another term. And there doesn't seem to have been a groundswell of folks calling on him to serve 4 more years, as George Washington faced in 1796. Still, he had reason to be proud of the work that he and his administration had done. They had seen the United States through a war that had ended with slight territorial gains and greater prestige abroad, and the nation, as well as its capital city, were in recovery. Indeed, according to Dolly Madison biographer Catherine Algor, with the peace and the resolution that the federal government would remain in the District of Columbia, quote, attracted to the new opportunities, people arrived in droves in Washington. Still, the wounds of war cut deep. Though Dolly had reestablished her place as the center of Washington society, she had far fewer resources at her disposal than before. As noted by historians David B. Mattern and Holly C. Schulman, quote, she had to outfit the new residents with almost no money. Their own funds were being stretched to support family. Dolly bought what she could secondhand through members of the American legation in France and purchased furniture from the house the Gallatins were closing up in Washington. Likewise, James Madison had had to rebuild his cabinet at the end of the war, and in January 1816, he could feel good about where his administration stood. Now that he was firmly out of Jefferson's shadow and stood as president in his own right, he had managed to get the support in place that he needed to accomplish the work that needed to be done. His cabinet was finally firmly in alignment, and they worked in sync to try to restore the nation's finances and plot a path forward for the peacetime military. But there's always a but, isn't there? As 1816 began, there were two potential contenders for the presidential nomination, and both were in Madison's cabinet. Again, though it went unstated directly, enough hints had been dropped in the National Intelligencer, which at that point was known to be the mouthpiece of the administration in print, to let everyone know that Secretary of State James Monroe was Madison's chosen successor. As a known protege of Thomas Jefferson, it was also assumed that he had the Sage of Monticello's endorsement as well. There was one concern, though. The War of 1812 had completely exhausted Monroe. As we've seen in this series, Monroe was at times the glue that kept the administration together, serving as the head of both the State and War Departments at times, and even being active in the field, trying to gather information and rally defenses as the nation's capital was threatened. By the summer of 1815, Monroe had to leave Washington to return home to his plantation Highlands in order to rest. As described by historian Robert Rutland, quote, he, i.e. Monroe, had been under constant strain since August 1814, and friends who had not seen him since then were shocked at his appearance. Besides the loss of weight, which made him appear haggard, Monroe had fretted over the health of his daughter and was finding it hard to pay his debts. Though since the Virginia Ratification Convention of 1788, these two men had alternated between being rivals and allies, by 1815, Monroe had proven himself in the estimation of James Madison that he saw him as the best person to succeed him as president upon his retirement. However, that summer, he had reason to worry that Monroe's health might prevent him from doing so, and thus kept up with reports of his health. Madison was also able to get a first-hand account when the Monroes stopped at Montpelier on the first week of October that year. In terms of his official responsibilities, as well as providing a sympathetic ear as he recounted his personal woes, Madison did what he could to support his trusted lieutenant and to ease his worries. Meanwhile, other contenders popped up to challenge Monroe's spot as the favored candidate. We've mentioned Secretary of War William H. Crawford before, and indeed, I invite you to listen to his 3-part Seat at the Table episode to learn more about him. For our purposes, just know that this 44-year-old up-and-coming politician had risen from being a supporter of the Madison administration in the Senate to serving as U.S. Minister to France, and had been invited upon leaving that post to join the administration as the head of the War Department. Versus the 57-year-old Monroe, his candidacy seems rather like Monroe's own candidacy against Madison in the 1808 election cycle, seeking a fresh, younger voice, as opposed to the older establishment candidate. Indeed, given that Monroe, if he won election, would be the 4th of 5 presidents to date from Virginia, it's understandable that folks may be seeking a change. There was also one more long-shot candidate in the mix as the year began. The 41-year-old Daniel D. Tompkins had served admirably as the wartime governor of New York, and he was put forward by supporters in the state as a candidate for president. Indeed, he was the unanimous choice of Democratic Republicans in the state legislature. However, not everyone was on board the Tompkins bandwagon. U.S. Attorney for the District of New York, Jonathan Fisk, wrote at the end of 1815, quote, "May the day never arrive in the history of this republic when any character, however great and popular, shall be placed in the executive chair who has never had any experience in the general government. It may do to take green hands for members of Congress, but it would be madness to take such for the executive." It seems that others agreed with Fisk's point of view as the push for Tompkins soon fizzled out. Thus, it would end up being a contest between Monroe and Crawford for the nomination. Now, considering that both men were in the outgoing president's cabinet, this made for an awkward position, and thus, on February 1st, 1816, Crawford's official spokesman, his successor in the Senate, William W. Bibb of Georgia, had a statement published in the National Intelligencer outlining that when he asked Crawford whether he consented to have his name in contention in the nomination contest that year, quote, he, i.e. Crawford, replied without reserve that he did not consider himself among the number of those from whom the selection ought to be made, and that he was unwilling to be held up as a competitor for that office. Simple enough, right? Except that some Crawford supporters kept up the fight. Whether they were unconvinced that the bowing out of the contest was sincere, or they thought that he could be convinced if he won the nomination to accept it, we'll never know. But they continued to push for his candidacy and called for a congressional caucus on March 12th, which they felt would go in their favor. Monroe was well aware of the situation, and at some point in this time period, drafted an 8-page memorandum where he went through the entire situation and tried to determine how to respond. Monroe, too, doubted Crawford's denial of his candidacy, given that his supporters continued on without missing a beat. The Secretary of State felt that his cabinet colleague should answer to a Monroe supporter about whether Crawford was truly withdrawing from the contest, and that if Crawford's folks continued to push for a caucus, Monroe supporters should sit out the process and leave it to the voters to decide between the two. The Crawfordites caucus of the 12th could only agree to call another caucus in a few days' time. On the 15th, Monroe's supporters met and agreed to attend the second caucus, while 22 of the campaigners for Crawford decided to boycott the second caucus in protest, throwing out the original plan of attending, formally withdrawing Crawford's name from consideration, and voting to support Monroe. The latter plan would have made Crawford look like a unifier and helped to firm up his place in the political world as the likely successor to Monroe in 4 or 8 years. Instead, when the caucus met on March 16th, though Speaker of the House Henry Clay moved to forego making a nomination, his motion failed, and when balloting was completed, Monroe came out on top, but only 11 votes ahead of Crawford, 65 to 54 votes. By a more decisive vote of 80 to 30, New York Governor Tompkins was chosen as the VP running mate. Now, there's always the what-if scenario of what might have happened if Crawford's supporters had shown up and, seeing the way the wind was blowing, thrown their support to the Secretary of War. We'll never know. Meanwhile, little did anyone know that an event that had happened nearly a year prior was about to have a major impact on the course of events in the United States for the remainder of the year. On the evening of April 5th, 1815, on the Sangar Peninsula on Sumbawa Island in the archipelago that we now know as Indonesia, a mountain named Tambora began to erupt. As described by Gillen Darcy Wood, quote, "A skyward jet of flame burst from the summit, lighting up the darkness and rocking the earth beneath their feet. The noise was incredible, painful. Huge plumes of flame issued from the mountain for 3 hours, until the dark mist of ash became confused with the natural darkness, seeming to announce the end of the world. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the column of fire collapsed, The earth stopped shaking, and the bone-jarring roars faded. This was only a temporary lull, for on the evening of April 10th, quote, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history occurred, wiping all the villages on the Sengar Peninsula from existence within hours. The explosions from the volcano were heard over 1,000 miles away, and within 24 hours, as described by historians William and Nicholas Klingemann, quote, the ash cloud had expanded to cover an area approximately the size of Australia. Air temperatures in the region plunged dramatically, perhaps as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Then a light southeasterly breeze sprang up, and over the next several days, most of the ash cloud drifted over the islands west and northwest of Tambora. By the time the cloud finally departed, villages within 20 miles of the volcano were covered with ash nearly 40 inches thick. Those 100 miles away found 8 to 10 inches of ash on the ground. For context, Klingemann and Klingman note that, quote, even a small quantity of ash could devastate plants and wildlife. It's estimated that over 12,000 individuals died within the first 24 hours or shortly thereafter the eruption began. However, the impacts from the Tambora eruption had only just begun. 55 million tons of sulfur dioxide gas had been sent into the stratosphere by the eruption, and this combined with hydroxide gas, quote, to form more than 100 million tons of sulfuric acid, which then, quote, condensed into minute droplets that could easily remain suspended in the air as an aerosol cloud. Had it remained at lower levels of the atmosphere, rain would have cleared it from the air. But in the stratosphere, it could linger. Within 2 weeks, the cloud had surrounded the planet at the equator, and within a few months, it had expanded, quote, into a single coherent cloud that covered Earth. If you're thinking that doesn't sound good, dear listener, you would be correct. It wasn't good at all. Basically, this aerosol cloud, quote, scattered shortwave solar radiation back into space, while allowing much of the long-wave radiant heat from the Earth to escape. This would cause the surface temperature on average to drop, though it should be noted that the impacts of this effect were uneven. In the U.S. west of the Appalachian Mountains and in Russia, there were only minimal temperature variations. On the American East Coast and in Europe, however, seasonal temperatures dipped 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit lower than average. While that may not sound like much, coupled with changes to precipitation, it made for torrential downpours and heavier snows at times across the Northeast. As anyone who has tried their hand at an outdoor garden knows, too little or too much rain can be detrimental for growing plants, and you're certainly not growing much of anything in unexpected snowy conditions. Funny enough, the impact on the eastern U.S. was not immediate. Indeed, the winter of 1815-1816 was noted as being milder than normal, which, as the Klingemans explain, the aerosol cloud could have played a role in making that happen. Then, however, there was April. In the middle of the month, a heavy snow fell in the upper states, only to be replaced by the end of the month by a heat wave that had highs in Vermont in the low 80s. May then heralded, quote, snow and freezing temperatures in New England. By mid-month, crops in Virginia and even in parts of Tennessee were being killed off by frost. By the end of the month, conditions had not improved, and folks were complaining about the quote-unquote strange weather and its devastating agricultural impact. June saw temperatures fluctuating between heat in the 80s in Massachusetts to just a few days later, temps dropping by 30 degrees or more in one day with heavy snows falling. Worse, the Arctic air masses plunging the temperatures down so low spread as far south as the Carolinas. Crops and livestock were wiped out en masse, and one person impacted wrote around this time, quote, what is to become of this country? It is impossible to divine, distressing beyond description. As noted by historian Gillen Darcy Wood, though, quote, the year 1816 was not the coldest in the annals of the eastern United States in terms of average temperatures, it is the only one to record frost in each of the summer growing months, June, July, and August. Extreme dry conditions also prevailed. This deadly combination of frost and drought ensured the summer of 1816's notoriety as the shortest growing season in history. The agricultural impact was such that it even got a mention in Madison's annual message sent to Congress on December 3, 1816. It began as follows, quote, in reviewing the present state of our country, our attention cannot be withheld from the effect produced by peculiar seasons, which have very generally impaired the annual gifts of the earth and threatened scarcity in particular districts. While it's beyond the scope of this podcast to go into all the impacts of the Tambora eruption, I did want to at least bring to mind what was happening with what was dubbed the year without a summer for a few key reasons. First, while there were some who looked to science to explain this weather phenomenon, others leaned into what was already a growing trend of religious revivalism that would be dubbed the Second Great Awakening to make sense of the senseless. Using a case study in Western New York, the Klingemans note that, while Presbyterian churches in that area had gained on average around 500 new members a year in the years between 1812 and 1815, that number doubled to over 1,000 in 1816 and jumped to nearly 2,000 in 1817. As we'll see, this movement would have an impact on the nation's history as a whole, and presidential history in particular, as we go along. The economic impact of the year without a summer would also be a shot in the arm for another trend already underway: westward migration. Virginia in particular, the state that to this point had been home to 3 of the 4 presidents, would conclude in a legislative committee report in 1816 that, quote, a very large portion of her western territory is yet unimproved, while a considerable part of her eastern has receded from its former opulence. How many sad spectacles do her lowlands present of wasted and deserted fields, of dwellings abandoned, of churches in ruins. Over the next 12 years, land in Virginia would lose over half its value, and over a third of the white children born in the Old Dominion around 1800 would leave the state. From a presidential history standpoint, this would, of course, impact the future financial situation of Virginian presidents past, present, and future, as the poor harvest of 1816 will be replicated in the next few years, and coupled with future economic downturns. We've already seen what happened with Jefferson, but we'll have to wait to see the impact on Madison and Monroe. The times, they were a-changin', but there was one thing that could be counted on in 1816, that there were no limits to the lengths that white enslavers would go to recapture the individuals that they saw as their property. In the latter half of 1813, as described in episode 4.35, British forces had effectively taken control of Pensacola, and they decided that, in order to better fortify their position in the area, a new fort had to be constructed. As described by historian Matthew J. Clavin, quote, British officials ordered the establishment of a headquarters on the eastern bank of the Apalachicola River. Located 15 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, atop a 10 to 15 foot high cliff, this site was called Achatwaithle by local Indians, but the Spanish referred to it as the Hill of Beautiful View, or Prospect Bluff. Construction began in May 1814, and the British worked to attract local recruits to join their forces at Prospect Bluff. They approached the settlements of native peoples, including the Muskogee and Seminole along the Apalachicola River, as well as camps of black people who were formerly enslaved and had sought their freedom in the wilderness. When the British withdrew from the area in the summer of 1815 with the coming of peace with the U.S., they not only left the fort to the self-emancipated black people and native peoples gathered at Prospect Bluff, but they also left them, quote, a massive store of arms and ammunition. Naturally, white enslavers in the Gulf South did not like the situation one bit, and by July 1815, a prominent politician and planner in the Mississippi Territory wrote to General Andrew Jackson urging him to deal with the situation at Prospect Bluff. The sole British officer left in the area who was charged with, quote, looking after the free black community, instead told American agents that the British were unlikely to return to protect the community and offered his help and the help of Muskogee and Seminole allies in the region to destroy the fort. This community, which historian Matthew Clavin notes was, quote, the largest fugitive slave settlement in the history of the present-day United States, would govern itself for just over a year. They organized a governing structure which, as they were constantly fearful of invasion by the Americans, was tightly controlled, and Clavin asserts could, quote, best be described as martial law. They were able to control, quote, maritime traffic on the lower Apalachicola River and participated in an extensive trade network with native villages in the area. All things being equal, they could have maintained their settlement on a permanent basis without much of an issue. However, there was one big issue: the United States. Though there's no way of knowing solid figures, it is known that some people enslaved in the United States sought their freedom by fleeing to the fort at Prospect Bluff, which added a sense of urgency on the part of white Southerners to eliminate the threat of the self-emancipated black community there sooner rather than later. With the murder of 2 white land prospectors in the Mississippi Territory at the hands of Muskogee, who refused to abandon their lands in February 1816, the federal government decided to act to end all threats in the area, including at Prospect Bluff. Madison did initially try to go the diplomatic route, as technically Prospect Bluff was in Spanish-held Florida, and, as discussed last episode, the administration was trying to smooth out relations with Spain. Thus, Madison ordered General Jackson in March to reach out to the new governor of West Florida, Mauricio de Zuniga, to urge action on his part against Prospect Bluff and to hold off on taking any action himself until Madison gave the word. Now, as we've already seen, Jackson didn't let small details like sovereignty of nations or official instructions from the government get in the way of him doing whatever he pleased. Thus, he sent word to General Edmund Gaines on April 8, 1816, to go ahead and destroy the fort at Prospect Bluff, as well as any, quote, town or village that offered shelter to the murderers of the 2 land prospectors. As Gaines planned his assault and attempted to get native allies in the area to aid in the attack, first an American agent in the area, then Jackson reached out to Spanish Governor Zuniga to urge him to act. Zuniga responded that, though he too wished for the fort to be destroyed as it threatened Spanish interest in East and West Florida, he had to wait for orders from his superiors in Cuba before he could act. He expected that the Americans would wait until he received his orders from Havana, but the wheels were already in motion. At the end of June 1816, a U.S. gunboat set sail from New Orleans bound for the Apalachicola River to support Gaines's attack on Prospect Bluff. Ground forces for the assault numbered over 300 and included both American soldiers and native Allied forces. The first brief skirmish occurred on the morning of July 15th, when American forces came upon inhabitants from Prospect Bluff, quote, pulling a small craft out of the river. On the 20th, the assault began in earnest, and for 6 days, as Muskogee allies of the Americans kept up quote-unquote irregular fire on the fort, quote, the defenders responded by unleashing the full power of their arsenal. The Muskogee also proceeded, quote, to secure the fort's perimeter and destroy all the fruit, corn, and other provisions growing in the adjacent fields. On July 27th, after the arrival of U.S. naval forces, which promptly linked up with the ground forces, the naval gunboats began their cannon assault on the fort. For the first hour, they seemed to be at a stalemate. But then, a cannonball from gunboat 154, quote, flew over the fort's outer perimeter and landed directly on the Citadel's gunpowder magazine. The result was a massive explosion that some claimed to hear more than 100 miles away. With that, the defense shattered, and the American and native forces moved in. Estimates vary, but it is believed that around 200 to 300 self-emancipated black individuals and around 25 Choctaw were in the fort prior to the assault, and only around 25 to 50 survived the explosion. Reports from American sailors on hand asserted that around 200 were buried, while, quote, a great number could not be extricated from under the ruins. For those who survived the explosion, many met their end at the hands of the invading Muskogee warriors. The American commander in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Clinch, stepped in to prevent their native allies from killing all the survivors. But this was not done for altruistic reasons. His intent all along had been to try to capture as many of the residents at Prospect Bluff as possible and return them to slavery. Ultimately, due to the massive loss of life from the explosion and subsequent invasion, only 7 individuals from Prospect Bluff were returned to enslavement in the United States. As described by Clavin, this battle, quote, was a major victory for American slave owners. The elimination of this one-of-a-kind sanctuary greatly reduced the chance of enslaved people finding freedom by taking flight across the southern border. Just as importantly, the federal government had demonstrated an eagerness to sacrifice men and treasure on slave owners' behalf. Force, however, was not the only means by which the Madison administration attempted to achieve peace in the southern part of the nation. Despite Andrew Jackson's best efforts to convince leaders in Washington otherwise, as described last episode, Secretary of War William Crawford concluded a treaty with the Cherokee on March 22, 1816, to return to them 4 million acres that had been taken in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, as well as to provide $25,500 in compensation, quote, for war damages, destruction of crops and livestock, inflicted by the Tennessee militiamen. As you can imagine, Jackson was none too pleased with this, and he was not alone. Many leaders in the West were upset at this news, and Crawford's hand was forced to the point that he had to concede to demands for, quote, the appointment of 3 commissioners to conclude treaties with the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. Also bowing to the political pressure, Jackson was appointed as one of the commissioners. Thus, by September 8, 1816, Jackson and his fellow commissioners began to meet with the Cherokee and Chickasaw at the Chickasaw Council House. It was clear from the onset, however, that Jackson was the driving force in these negotiations, and he was out for land. Jackson quickly decided to break the negotiations apart, and thus he was able to separately reach an agreement with the Cherokee on September 14th and the Chickasaw on September 20th, which ceded, quote, a landmass nearly a quarter of the amount taken from the Creeks by the Treaty of Fort Jackson, for the price of just under $200,000. Then they proceeded to the Choctaw Trading House, where an agreement was reached on October 24th for the Choctaw to relinquish, quote, land east of the Tombigbee River for an annual payment of $16,000 for 20 years and $10,000 in merchandise. These acquisitions would reshape the region, as we'll learn more about as we progress forward in future episodes. Further north, preparations were being made for westward expansion as well. A young Army engineer named Stephen Long had been ordered by the War Department in 1816 to travel from St. Louis up the Illinois River to Lake Peoria to inspect the fort that had been constructed there back in 1813 and to determine what, quote, repairs or alterations were needed to make it a proper bulwark, quote, against the British and their Indian allies. Long traveled the 180 miles through the, quote, level, sometimes marshy valley lined with limestone bluffs up to Lake Peoria, where he found Fort Clark, quote, illy calculated for defense. Long recommended, quote, a log and stone fort 264 feet on each side, with walls of earth and logs 18 feet high. Before the work on the new structures could be completed, in a reflection of just how fast conditions in the West were shifting, the fort was ordered closed, as, quote, the military frontier had moved farther north and west. Americans were pushing into the frontier faster than ever before, and Long, in his second mission at the end of 1816, would get a first-hand view of what was to come. A month after returning to St. Louis, Long set off again as he was ordered, quote, to map parts of the unsettled areas in Illinois and Indiana. They went up to Fort Dearborn, which is the location of present-day Chicago, and then across northern Illinois and Indiana to Fort Wayne. As discussed in earlier episodes, only a few short years before, this portion of the Midwest had been home to Prophetstown and Tecumseh's Native Confederacy. Before Long even set out, Congress had already passed the Enabling Act, and Indiana had convened a constitutional convention to draft a state constitution to allow Indiana to join the Union as the 19th state, which Indiana would do before the year was out, with Madison signing the congressional resolution to admit Indiana on December 11th. As he traveled through the region, Long envisioned a canal connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River via the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers, as well as, quote, a road leading from the seat of government to the northwestern frontier. Long could see what was coming for the region, and he did not believe the changes would be long in coming. However, we must leave things there for now, for our time together is drawing to a close. I hope you'll join me next time for the final episode on Madison's presidency. Until then, thanks so much again to Cassie of the Autocrat Podcast and Meredith of the Alexander Standard for providing the opening quotes for this episode. And be sure to check out both of those amazing podcasts once you're done with this episode. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. If you'd like to enlist Christian's services for your podcast, check out his website at yourpodcastpal.com. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon for graciously allowing us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. I'll have links to all of these available on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and links to much more information about all of the American presidents. You can also find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Whether it's through a rating and review, or if you sign up as a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/presidencies, I cannot thank you enough for your support. Please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
In the middle of the continental U.S., there is a special stretch of land, formerly known as the Neutral Strip or No Man's Land. It was at one point the most lawless place in the world. In the heart of America and the middle of nowhere, a special group of people left their mark on this country, though their stories are not known to a wide audience. Our Nowhere Panhandle Histories details the fascinating, strange, and meaningful stories from the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles. Sponsored by Oklahoma Panhandle State University, tune in and hear all about the hidden heart of America.